I'm a little late to the party, but I have finally finished Kingdom Come Deliverance, and I want to talk about the game, tell you my final thoughts, and of course tell you whether or not I think this is a good game. Spoiler alert, I do. It's bloody brilliant. Now, if for some reason you've ended up on this video and yet have no idea what Kingdom Come Deliverance is, it is a medieval role-playing game. That is, a role-playing game set in the medieval times, not a role-playing game that was made in medieval times, just in case you were getting a little confused about that. When you first look at this game, you could be forgiven for thinking that it is a fairly typical first-person fantasy RPG, but it's not. I mean, it's got swords, it's got armor, it's got horses. You know, on the surface it does look a little like a game such as Oblivion or Skyrim, but it has no magic, no dragons, no trolls, nothing like that. Well, I mean, it has an alchemy system, and, you know, there are some things that might be a little beyond the mundane, but it has nothing overtly magical, no overt fantasy trappings. However, even without the magic and the dragons and the wizards, if you've played a lot of first-person fantasy RPGs, you will feel very much at home when you start playing this initially, because, you know, on the surface it does resemble those. In fact, actually, the game that it reminded me of the most when I first tried it way back in the alpha stages was Oblivion, although that's probably something to do with the user interface, which has a very sort of old school Oblivion vibe. Before we start with this review, I do want to mention that in all of the footage you see, I have been using some visual mods that make it look a little different to what you might see in other games, and I'm also playing on hardcore mode. I've not played the normal difficulty, only hardcore difficulty, which is why my screen looks so empty. I'm using a mod that removes the background to the compass. Nothing else, it just removes the background to the compass. But hardcore mode pretty much removes most of the other useful information from the compass anyway, so you can see it's clear. Hardcore mode also removes things like your health, your stamina bar, and I'm using a mod that removes the dot that appears at the center of the screen. Now, that dot disappears when you're shooting with your bow anyway, so if you're thinking, oh, doesn't that make bow use harder? No, it doesn't, because in the normal game, the dot is always removed as soon as you pull your bow out. So, beware of that when watching the footage on screen. I have used a few mods to tweak things, but also a lot of the things that are missing are because of hardcore mode. Graphically, this game is pretty good. It's a bit of a mixed bag though. For example, the landscape, the scenery is phenomenal. It looks really, really good. It's very hard to put your finger on why. It's pretty solid all round, but it just seems to have so many little details that bring the land to life, make it feel very realistic. Now, the word realistic is something that you're going to hear a lot when discussing Kingdom Come Deliverance. I don't like that word because obviously in gaming, realistic is probably something that's never going to happen. But in this particular case, there is something very realistic about the way the game feels because of these little details. An example of this would be puddles, the little potholes you find in roads. They really do look real, and they look so real that you find yourself avoiding them. You don't want to walk through them as you probably would in other games. The paths just feel very natural, and more importantly, everything did not look made for you the player. There were plenty of things that just seemed to have been made either for other people or just because that's the way the land flows. For an example of this would be streams. In a lot of games I play, streams are always easy to sort of just walk across or jump across. In this game, streams are quite realistic. You know, they're not always these little flat meandering things that just look nice. You can find yourself wandering around in the dark and just falling into a stream because it's sort of a meter deep drop and it's hidden by all the grass. You can hear the stream, but you can't see it until the last moment. It can actually be quite dangerous to wander around the countryside in the dark, especially if you're drunk. And yeah, that's something that can and probably will happen. Probably more frequently in my playthrough than it did in most others, although I don't know. You know, the game, it doesn't discourage the consumption of alcohol, shall we say. It's not all perfect. There are some lighting issues. For example, I got a fairly aggressive flickering in the early hours of the morning. If I would wander around at 3 a.m, there would be an almost flashing effect, which I just did not seem to be able to fix. And I'm not using any mods or anything like that would have affected that. There is the odd texture pop in, and there is some element of popping in of objects as well. And I wasn't all that impressed with things like hair. There were times when hair, beards, etc. didn't really convince me as much as some other aspects. Some of the weather effects weren't always brilliant. Rain, for example, sometimes felt a little low quality. Although I have to say, when it was raining, generally speaking, I was very impressed with the atmosphere, especially at night. It makes everything feel cold, damp, wet. You kind of want to get inside, so it really has a very immersive feel, you know, when it comes to the weather. On a related subject, I do have to talk about the performance of the game. It does have the occasional problem performing and keeping the frame rate at something like 60 frames a second, even if you begin to turn some of the details down. I've got a good system. The graphics card is a 1080 Ti, and the CPU is old, but it should be good enough for a game like this. And I did find myself dipping below 60 frames a second quite consistently. It didn't bother me too much when it happened because it usually was happening in city areas, so you know it wasn't quite as important to have the high frame rate, but I did notice it happening, and it was pretty damned consistent. And as I said, I'm not running any really high graphics settings. I'm running probably about medium to high depending on the setting. My system's pretty strong. You would have expected it to keep 60 frames a second solid. There were moments sometimes where it would drop even lower than that, especially if there were a lot of villagers wandering around. And I can tell you, in the big battles, the frame rate could tank. I'm talking 15 frames a second and lower, single digits at times. Sometimes it felt a bit like, not quite a slideshow, but it was pretty bad. Those moments did not come very often though. It's the really big battles. There are not many of them, there are a handful, but when it happens, it really does slow down the system, which is a shame because those big battles could have been epic. But the problem is, because of the performance, they tend to feel more frustrating and confusing more than anything. However, in some ways that does add to the feeling of total chaos during those battles. I did find myself almost resorting to just running forward and hitting things with the hammer on the head over and over again and forgetting any semblance of skill because I just couldn't react to anything anyway because of the frame rate, and there was so much confusion. Just running forward and hitting things with a hammer seemed to be the best plan. So in some ways you could even argue that this was an immersive addition. I wouldn't. I would have preferred 60 frames a second during those battles as well, but it didn't happen often enough that I would say it destroyed the game or even hurt it in any way, really. I'd say the worst thing about it was they obviously understood they had a performance issue, and so they tried to split some of these epic battles into stages with loading screens between them. And you know, you'd do one little section of a fight for 2 minutes, and then there'd be a loading screen, and then there'd be another section and a cutscene, and it felt a little jilted, a little sort of stuttery in the narrative flow. I think if they could have solved the performance issues, it would have been nice if the battles just flowed, if you just went from one stage to the next fluidly, constantly feeling like you were fighting all the time. But my guess is they just could not manage that. I'm hoping in any future games they can find some way to improve performance. It does seem to be linked to the number of NPCs on screen, and of course in a big battle there are a lot of them. Perhaps they could have some system in those big battles where they just reduce the details of the enemies, because when it comes down to it, you could probably have reduced the textures and reduced all the polygons on all of those soldiers that I was fighting, and I would never have noticed. It was so hectic, it was so chaotic, I was not looking at the details. So maybe there was some way they could, you know, on the fly tweak it. I don't know. It could just be an AI issue. Who knows? But just be warned, the performance is generally okay, but never brilliant, and there are moments where it will dip and become fairly noticeably bad. Having got the technical nerdy stuff out of the way, let's move on to subjects that are much more important in my opinion, and I'm going to start with the story. The story in Kingdom Come Deliverance is brilliant. It's a great story, it's really well told through a series of very good quests, and also some very engaging cutscenes that give you a little more insight into your own character and let you connect with some of the other characters that you will be meeting. The main quest often feels fairly epic and important and serious, but it is broken up with moments of real comedy that feel very natural and believable, and yet really can be, well, totally ridiculous. There are some quests that involve, well, a lot of alcohol, shall we say, and occasionally other substances that will affect your judgment. I don't want to spoil things too much, but generally speaking, the main quest, you know, it takes you through the game, allows you to experience a lot of the side quests as well, and keeps you engaged in a variety of different ways. It's not like you're doing the same thing over and over again. The different parts of the main quest all feel very, very different. The only thing that I would say that I did tend to sort of, not complain about, but did notice fairly frequently, is how often I found myself thinking, is there nobody else that can do this? Like, there are so many things that need to be done, and apparently I have to do them all. Although it is explained in some way that after the initial attack, I won't discuss that too much, there is a shortage of reliable people. But there are times where you will be thinking to yourself, come on, there has to be someone else who can do this, someone more suitable for the job as well. But there isn't, so you're going to do it all. Some of it's going to be hideously dangerous, some of it's going to be hilarious fun, and honestly, I've got nothing to complain about when it comes to the main quest or the story. Really did enjoy it. One thing I do need to warn you about, it's not really like a bad thing, this is actually a good thing, but this game is not afraid of punishing you for tardiness. If you take too long to do something, the game will punish you. It will fail certain quests if you take too long, if you don't turn up to a meeting when you agreed to turn up, if you just hang around and do other things rather than going off and doing some urgent mission. It will have an effect. Some quests will just fail outright. Some will just have different results depending on when you got there. And honestly, you need to pay attention to what the NPCs are saying. If a character tells you that this is a critically urgent task, you may want to take them seriously, because it will, or it may, have an effect on the results. This is not a game like Skyrim where, you know, a dragon attacks a tower and you can turn up 2 years later and that attack is still going on. Now, if you do fail a task or you do get a somewhat negative result, the game does a very good job of allowing you to find other ways of achieving the goal if it's something really important. If it's a minor side quest, you may just fail it outright, but if it's the main quest, there is always some other way to get what you need to achieve, but it may not be as simple as the original one if you just got on with it and turned up on time. And it's things like this that I think distinguish Kingdom Come Deliverance from a lot of other RPGs. A willingness to have consequences for the things you do, and a willingness to make you prepare, to make you think about what's going to happen and have to make some tough decisions. Obviously, in a game like this, the interactions you have with the NPCs, with the other people in the world, are very important, and that has a great effect on the game. Now, this game does have quite a lot of dialogue. It's not afraid of having long dialogue, which I love. It really does help with the story, and it helps you get to know different characters, and in general the dialogue is really well done. There are occasionally moments where an option will appear that probably should have waited until you'd said something else, or you'll have an option to ask a question that you've kind of already asked in another way or at another time, and sometimes it does feel a little odd. Some of the animations during the conversations are a little over the top. It always reminds me of a theatre actor who's used to acting on stage and having to wave his arms around wildly to get an emotion across, suddenly making the transition to movie or TV and not quite managing it. You know, they wag their fingers, and it's a really sort of overemphasized, sort of hammishly exaggerated wagging of the finger. But overall, it's a very solid dialogue system. One of the things that you will find with Kingdom Come Deliverance, though, is the way the NPCs react to you can change depending on, well, a lot of things. Your reputation with them, your behavior, for example. I mean, if you're crouching in the middle of a street, people will react to it. If you have your sword out and you're wandering around town, people will comment on it. If you don't have a torch out when you're walking around at night, the guards will actually tell you off. You're not allowed to do that. But they will also react to the clothes that you're wearing. If you're wearing armor, a lot of armor, they may think of you as a knight. If you're wearing rich clothes, they will treat you like a rich noble. If you're wearing rags, they will treat you like a beggar. And they will also react to your state of cleanliness, for example. So if you're dirty, they may comment on it. If you've been fighting 4 or 5 bandits on the outskirts of town and you're covered in blood, and you come back in and you don't wash before you wander in and start talking to people, they will comment on it because you just splattered in blood. So you're going to actually need to wash yourself just before you go and speak to people after battles. And indeed, that sort of thing is fairly big in this game. You don't just get to wash your hands and feet in a trough sometimes. You can go off to a bathhouse and have your gear completely cleaned, and you will actually gain benefits from it as well. People will start reacting to you really well if you've just had a bath and you smell great and you have the right perks to go with that. And that is really good to see. There is a character system, as you would expect in an RPG, and you have the usual sort of things, stats like strength, agility, vitality. You have speech, which sounds like a skill, but is considered a stat. Then you also have some things like charisma. Now, charisma is less about you personally and more what you are wearing. So this is often set by the clothes you're wearing, whether or not you've got buffs for having a bath, that sort of thing. You also have visibility, which is how hard you are to see. That's obviously going to be for stealth. And conspicuousness, which is somewhat different. You could be very, very easy to see, very high visibility, but low conspicuousness, as in people just are not going to pay you any attention. All of these things are decided by what you're wearing and sometimes some of the skills and buffs you have. On some of the stats and skills, you actually have perks which you can get at certain levels, and they do the usual sort of things that you might expect perks to do. There are combat skills for defense, warfare, axe, bow, mace, sword, and unarmed. And as you can see, some of them have perks and some of them don't. Most of the perks for things like axe or sword are combos, which we'll discuss later on in the combat section. And there are skills for things like alchemy, drinking, herbalism, and you can see them. There's a lot of different skills. Now, one of the things I noticed very early on about this game that differs from some other games such as Skyrim is how much your character's skills will affect the way you play. So your combat skills. Now this game has a very different combat mechanic, and you do need to get better at that personally, but in actual fact your character also needs to get better at it, and you will find your character, if you have high sword skill, will land blows way more often and be able to defend better if their skill is high. So even when you start a new game, when you go back and have all of your skills being pretty low, you're not going to have as easy a time of it as you did on your last playthrough where you had high skills. Even though your own personal skill at the combat system is better, the game does a very good job of making you feel limited by the particular build you currently have. And this is true of plenty of the skills, including reading. You start the game unable to read. You cannot read, and you actually have to go off and learn how to read. So even something as little as that, some small little detail, really enhances the experience. You're a blacksmith, you can't read, you need to go and learn to read. This isn't something that happens in most RPGs. Most RPGs just have you being able to read from the moment go. So I love little details like this. There are even skills for drinking to get better at being able to handle your alcohol, and also what happens when you consume too much alcohol, because you can actually get blind, drunk, and pass out in this game. Oh, and reading books will improve your reading skill, obviously, but there are actually some benefits to choosing where to read as well. You can get a boost from sitting comfortably somewhere before you begin to read. The equipment system is pretty good. As you can see, it's a fairly standard sort of user interface for your inventory. It's actually kind of old school. You can probably see why I got an Oblivion feel from this. But things like armor are really well done in this game. It has layers. It will allow you to place a lot of different layers on your character. So I'm going to remove the fashionable hat, and I'm going to put on a gambeson instead of the shirt, and some protection for my head. But I can also put things on the wrist. I could put a hood over this. I could put a helmet on if I want. I'm going to put some chainmail on. And as you can see, it begins to layer things up. But it also begins to add to my armor levels against stabbing, slashing, and blunt. And so you really do need a mix of armor if you want to be completely protected. And there's plate as well. As you get further into the game, you're going to start getting better and better armor, and you'll look more the knight in shining armor if that's the way you want to go, or the mercenary, or perhaps you just want to stick to the black clad stealthy type character. It's completely up to you. I should also warn you that if you want to go the fully plate armor route and have a helmet with a visor, it will have an effect in game when you take your weapon out. You put the visor down, and it looks very cool, but I actually found it a little, well, distracting, and sometimes it made combat a little harder. You are better protected, that's for sure. However, let me put my sword away because this guard will actually mention it otherwise. I did find when the visor was down, Because I was playing hardcore mode and I didn't have a UI element for the combat indicator, you would occasionally have your character being knocked around a bit, and he'd have his head tilted down, and you can't quite see your enemies, the top of their head, and you can't see the weapon if they've got it raised above their hands, and it can be a little tough to see the weapon incoming when you want to block it. So you actually have to decide, is it worth wearing a full visor helm? And I ended up deciding no, it wasn't, even though it gives you far more protection, especially against attacks that come straight at the face. You will also need to repair your gear. It gets damaged as well as dirty and covered in blood. You will need to use armourer's kits, tailor's kits, cobbler's kits, and blacksmith's kits, or you will need to visit, and that's only, by the way, if your skill in maintenance is good enough. If you are not good at maintenance, or you don't have those kits, or if your gear gets too damaged, you will actually have to go and repair it in town at a craftsman. So, for example, I can repair some of these items, but this Milanese brigandine I cannot repair. I do not have the capabilities to do that out here. I need to go and find an armor smith and have him fix this for me. And this deterioration does have an effect on the protection levels, but it also has a visual effect. You will actually be able to see your armor being dented. If you've got a completely 100% fixed up, totally clean breastplate, it will look shiny and new. But if it's dirty or it's got a lot of damage, you will see the dents on your character, which is very cool. You will also be able to see how the equipment is affecting how noisy you are, what your charisma is, how fast you can move. So if I start to remove some of these items, you'll begin to see I'm less noisy, my visibility improves because my visibility goes down, and I can actually make my charisma go up depending on what I decide to wear. So if I decide to wear something like the doublet, I will begin to look a little more charming. It really does depend on what the situation is, what the best clothing to wear is. Now, there is a stealth system and a lockpick system. However, I can tell you the lockpicking at first can be a little tricky. Once you get the hang of it and you raise your skill, because you do need skill with the character himself to be able to pull this off, it is doable. However, I found I had to adjust my mouse sensitivity a little when lockpicking. So I've actually got it set on my mouse to be able to reduce the sensitivity so that now I'm turning this much at a complete sweep of the arm, whereas normally I would turn this much. And that's just for lockpicking. I've heard on controller, picking locks can be even more frustrating. There is also a pickpocket system, and that is also somewhat tricky, and I recommend you try it to start with on sleeping people. It's not too difficult once your character gets more and more skilled in it, and you can start to get the hang of it and take, well, everything she owns, actually. There you go. But as I said, I would practice on sleeping people, and in fact, until you get good at it, I would practice on people who are somewhat further out of town so that you can make your escape when you inevitably get caught. There is also an alchemy system that is actually very cool. You'll find these alchemy stations dotted around, and you can make a variety of potions by doing, well, it's not complicated, but when you first start, it could be a little intimidating. So you might want to prepare all of the components from the recipe you have, And then you'll need to actually place these components in the cauldron, or perhaps you'll need to grind them in the mortar and pestle, and then you will need to boil the cauldron. Perhaps you have to wait using the sand glass for a little while, and you'll have to figure this all out yourself, because I don't want to spoil the surprise for you. Now, there is a recipe book, but believe it or not, you don't need to use it. You can experiment if you want, and if you discover a potion that way, it will appear in your list of recipes. Obviously, if you're not using a wiki, you're probably going to waste a lot of components. When you get better at alchemy, you can even take perks that allow you to auto brew, which will save you a lot of time. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a fantasy game, so these potions are not magical, although their effects often mimic that. They're somewhat extreme. You're supposed to think of these as, I don't know, enhancements, things that will give you a boost of stamina, things that will make you stronger, but some of the effects are a little, shall we say, pushing the boundaries. The Aqua Vitalis will actually make you 50% resistant to wounding, and there is a night vision potion. It doesn't make you see green and see in the dark like you've got night vision goggles on, but it will make your vision in the dark a lot better, and honestly, it's one of the best potions out there. There's even a potion that will make you stealthier. So you see they've pushed the boundaries a little here to give you some effects that could be considered a little magical. To be honest, this is no more magical than the fact that you can go to bed and heal wounds. You can actually go out and have a fight with some bandits and come close to death, be almost mortally wounded, and then just go and spend a few hours in the bathhouse and you'll probably be okay. Obviously, that is not realistic, but otherwise, every single time you had a fight, you'd probably have to go and spend 3 months resting and recuperating and doing physiotherapy, and that would make the game somewhat slower. So, you know, they have added some elements that you might think of as unrealistic, and the potions definitely fall in that category. But in this case, I think it was one of those concessions they pretty much had to make the game playable. Combat is obviously a big part of a game like this, and the combat is great in this game, but it can be frustrating. It's one of the areas that really distinguishes it from games such as Skyrim. It's nowhere near as simple, and it is going to be frustrating when you first start, but it can be massively rewarding. It never gets dull, even when you start getting very good at the combat and you've got great gear. If you start getting cocky, this game will punish you. It will put you down very quickly if you start thinking you're unkillable. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what the combat is like. It's quite difficult to explain it, and it's probably best if you just go try it yourself. You are going to end up relying on the game's lock-on mechanic. Even if you try not to lock on, the game will auto-lock on. It kind of needs to because of the way the mechanics work. Don't worry too much about it. It can be frustrating at first if you don't like lock-on mechanics, and I'm such a person, but you do get used to it. And you will find when you first start fighting, your character is bad at fighting too, and you may not even, I mean, if it's at the very early stages, you can't even block. But as you get better and you start to learn master strikes and that sort of thing, you will become more and more competent. However, once again, I'm going to warn you against getting cocky, because it's one thing to be good in a one-on-one situation, and it's a totally different thing when you're being surrounded. If you've got 2, 3, or even 4 opponents, this game becomes really hard, especially on hardcore mode. The enemy are constantly trying to get behind you, and woe betide you if that happens. It doesn't matter how tough you get, it doesn't matter what your skill is, or even what your armor is. If you get 4, maybe 5 guys hitting on you from all different angles, you are about to have a very bad day. Even a bunch of peasants with very crude clubs and spears can kill you pretty quickly if they start stunning you, and that is something that can happen. When they're hitting you in the back, you will get knocked about and you start losing control of the character. It can be absolutely infuriating, but it's part of the combat, it's part of the experience. The fact that you're losing control because you're being pummeled and you just can't put up a good defense and you can't take your enemies down. It forces you to constantly evaluate all of your battles. If you see a lot of opponents, you may want to move away. Get on your horse, move a bit away, try to engage them with the bow. Try to shoot them, get a few of them weak, or get them separated a little bit so you can fight maybe 1, 2, 3 at once and take them out. You will find yourself trying to focus on weak enemies you can down quickly. The ones who don't have much armor, you can just hit them with your sword and hopefully kill them just to get them out of the way. You may also find yourself switching weapons. If you're facing someone in heavy plate armor and your sword doesn't seem to be doing too much damage, you may want to switch to a mace or an axe, which will do a lot more blunt trauma damage. But if you're facing unarmored opponents, you may want something like the longsword because it has extra reach, and being able to close on your opponent is very important in this game. Armor is going to become very, very important. You can play this game without armor. You can fight and you can do lots of dodging, and the lighter the lighter the clothes you're wearing, the easier time you will have dodging, and also in making the distance to your enemy. It can be quite fun to just run around in a shirt and pants and boots fighting the enemy. You get a lot more mobility. You can even outrun them, maybe shoot them a little bit. Be warned though, if you get into a bow battle and you don't have much armor on, a single arrow can really ruin your day, whereas if you're wearing armor, you can resist a lot of arrows. And also, you really do need to keep your distance. If you get surrounded and you don't have armor on, you're dead. You can't dodge that many people. In a one-on-one fight, going without armor and just having a sword and try to play the sort of dashing rogue character, it's possible. You get 3 or 4 people attacking you, you really do need to move around, use the positioning, and focus on certain enemies. It is possible, but it's tougher. Armor is a way easier method of surviving, which does make sense because that's why we invented armor. Wandering around in chainmail and plate definitely gives you an advantage. Oh, and prepare to be irritated beyond words when it comes to combos. Combos are where you chain attacks together in a certain combination and you pull off a special move. Now, chained attacks are not that difficult to get going, and they are advantageous. You will do a lot more damage chaining your attacks. But to chain them in the specific order to get the combo move, it can be hit and miss. In one-on-one combat, it is a lot easier, but if you're facing a good opponent, all he has to do is block one of them and it will fail. And you find yourself kind of getting obsessed with trying to pull the combo off and then getting hit anyway. Master strikes, ripostes, are actually a lot more powerful, and it often is the better tactic to just wait for your opponent to attack you and counterattack them. But the opponent knows that too, and there are times where you'll be stood there waiting for the other to attack, and you will get frustrated and you will end up trying to pull off a combo, and it can be difficult. It does get easier with practice. It also gets easier once you realise each attack ends with the sword in a natural position for another attack, and many of the combinations, the attacks actually flow naturally, so you don't need to move the mouse. Usually you need to move the mouse on the second move, the second attack, and then after that you can hold it still, which does make it easier to do. But it's never as easy as Master Strikes, at least it wasn't for me. However, it is a ton of fun when you pull one off. And then, of course, there is the bow, which is actually a pretty powerful weapon in this game, but it can be, once again, a little frustrating when you first start playing. There's no crosshair, so you don't know exactly where you're aiming, so you've sort of got to get used to judging where the bow is aiming. I can also tell you when you first start playing, when you first pick up a bow, oh god, excuse me, your character is terrible at it. And if you hold the bow, can you see there's a little sway? When your character first picks up the bow, the sway is horrible. It's almost unusable. It's really hard to time. You can do it, but you should expect to miss a lot. You will get better over time, and you'll be able to shoot faster and more accurately, and you will get stronger bows. And honestly, when you do, when you pull off those shots, someone's running at you with a pike and you just shoot him in the face with an arrow, it feels so good. But there is a learning curve, both for you and your character. Once you get good at it, you will love it. But at first, it is going to annoy you no end. Be prepared for that. But that is actually a big part of this game. The fact that overcoming, well, your own weaknesses feels so good. And it's not just your own weaknesses, your own inability to shoot with a bow. It's Henry's, the character. Getting him better at shooting a bow feels very rewarding. And it really emphasizes how this game is an RPG, a role-playing game first, and not an action game. There are elements of action, but compared to a lot of other RPGs, this game massively emphasizes the RPG elements, and I think it benefits for it. It really enhances the experience, and when I win those fights, when I make those shots, when I manage to survive a fight with 6 enemies, and I was convinced I was going to die, I feel like I've just conquered the world. It's an incredible feeling, and it never gets dull. All the way through the game kept challenging me. Just as I started to feel a little cocky and almost invulnerable, I would go and get killed, or I'd come close to death and have to reevaluate my badassery. But it also manages to do it in a way that is not boring or annoying. Yes, the fights can be frustrating, but that's more the situation being frustrating. But they're never boring. Then I never found myself getting truly angry at the game. I didn't find myself getting really annoyed at the game itself, so much as I was getting annoyed at an enemy who was making my life difficult. You know, that bowman who kept shooting me at a distance, or that annoying guy who kept hitting me while I was trying to focus on the guy that had a big sword. I'd got angry with them, frustrated with my inability to stop him flanking, but not the game itself. And that is what I loved. That is why I'm so passionate about this game. The fact that it brought out these emotions, that it brought out my frustration and my anger without ever making me feel bad about playing the game. I never felt like the game was grindy. I never felt like it was giving me artificial time sinks. Everything in game made sense and was oddly fun, or even relaxing, even when things were a little slow. When I was doing Alchemy, it was so relaxing and engaging. Just overall, every moment I was playing Kingdom Come Deliverance, I was enjoying myself. Well, almost every moment. I mean, there are some times where things would happen that would just make me think, more directed towards the game, but they were few and far between. An example of this would be, I did have a minor problem with the user interface, the inventory, for example, and the trading, in that the game was not recognizing where my mouse was clicking for some odd reason. It took me a couple of hours to figure out what was going on, but I had to change the way I played this game. I couldn't use my mouse to select things in the inventory. I could use it to select tabs, but not items. I had to actually use the activate key to select an item to wear it, or to try and trade it. And that is weird because Kingdom Come Deliverance has an interface that looks designed for mouse. It really does have that classic PC RPG menu system that looks like it should work perfectly with mouse. And I also know very few people got this problem. There were some other people who got that problem too, and I think the only thing we shared in common is we all seem to be playing on 1440p resolution. I don't know if that's the thing, and there was some issue with scaling, but it was a problem I could not fix. I tried completely reinstalling the game afresh. Nothing would fix it. I had this problem from start to finish. It did not ruin the game for me, not even remotely. Once I got used to it and changed the way I did things a little, I just kind of got used to it and moved on. I know some people had a lot of glitches when the game first came out, but I actually didn't have that many. I did have one or two, like an NPC stood inside another NPC, but it wasn't that often, and I've played games with much worse. I do have a few minor complaints, but they're not really important ones. I'm probably going to deal with them in separate videos. An example of that would be the magic horse issue. Your horse will teleport to you if he's too far away to walk or run, and I found that a little jarring. Same is true with the magic chest. That's a chest where you put contents into it, and you can access those contents from various other chests all around the land, in all the different inns, etc. That was a bit jarring in a game like this, but it's barely worth mentioning from a review point of view. I am going to make some separate videos where I discuss that, just because it's an interesting subject, but not because it really affected my game that much. There is one minor issue with the AI in some of the random events. The events where you get attacked or ambushed by bandits, and you're riding along the road and you'll see a bandit in the middle of the road, or you'll see a log put across, and there's bandits there, and you stop 20 feet before the ambush point, clearly visible on your horse. The bandits must have seen and heard you, and you get off your horse, you sneak into the bushes, and then you creep around, killing them all, even though they're right next to each other. It's the middle of the day and not one of them react. It's almost as though they go into a sort of stupor until you get far enough and activate the ambush correctly. If you haven't activated the ambush, they're ridiculously, insanely easy to murder. So it's a minor issue, but it is worth mentioning. You can cheese a lot of the encounters if you're willing to abuse glitches like that, and it does feel like a bit of a glitch. One thing I should mention is the save mechanic, which is not something I particularly like. It uses a sort of save station mechanic. That is, your bed, you can sleep and it will save your game. I believe it also saves your game after major quest updates and cutscenes in the normal game, but in hardcore mode it doesn't. So if you have a 20-minute conversation and then a 10-minute cutscene, and then you ride off for 10 minutes and die, unfortunately, it probably hasn't auto-saved, and you have to go through the entire conversation and the entire cutscene once again. You can skip cutscenes, but you get the idea. So if you're playing hardcore mode, you might want to remember to sleep frequently, or use a kind of mobile save station that is Savior Schnapps. This is not something I particularly like, but it does work. Savior Schnapps are just potions that you can access when out and about. If you're out in the wilds doing something and you want to save, there's no bed for you to save at, so you just open up your inventory, go along to the potions, find the potion with the giant floppy disk icon on it. Yes, a floppy disk icon, and say to yourself, I shall save myself, and it will be done. It's well, yeah, not my favourite system ever. It breaks the fourth wall fairly abruptly, but honestly, I don't think it's that much of a problem. You get enough Savior Schnapps at the start of the game to save, easily enough to get through that stage and make it to Rattay. Once you've got to Rattay, you can actually make Savior Schnapps potions at the Alchemy bench, and even though one of the components, Belladonna, is reasonably rare-ish, it's not that expensive once you start harvesting all the plants and selling them, once you start making the potions, this will give you even more incentive to master alchemy early on. So perhaps if you hate alchemy, you're not going to like this. But honestly, alchemy is a very useful thing. So it probably will not affect you too much. You just need a reasonable supply of your floppy disk potions when you head out into the wilds, and you should be okay. The only way it's going to affect you is if you're one of these people who likes to save every 2 minutes, and you know, if you have a conversation and the result didn't go the way you want it, you want to reload all the time. It will probably stop you from doing that, unless of course you're on PC, in which case you can use a mod that will add a more traditional save system. But even if you hate this sort of system as much as I do, and you're not on PC so you can't mod it away, it wouldn't stop me from recommending this game. And I am recommending this game to any fans of RPGs. It really is a superb game. It looks great, feels great. The combat, whilst frustrating, is massively rewarding. The main quest is great. The side quests are great. It's a pleasure to play the game. It's a pleasure to do all of the usual things that you do when you do RPGs, looking after your equipment, trading, just traveling around on your horse, occasionally falling into ditches because Pebbles really hates me. Yes, that horse hates me. I know. But you know, everything about that. Yes, I know. It's probably because I can't ride the horse. Oh, that is one thing I did forget. I didn't mention. The horse controls on keyboard are a little weird because you have to sort of tap the keys to turn, and occasionally it registers as too big a tap and you'll fly off at a ditch. At least it did with my keyboard. It might just be the my keyboard keys are getting a little unresponsive or something. It was much easier using a controller, right? But overall, as I was saying, getting distracted, this is a game I really do recommend. It's an old school RPG that's not afraid of being an old school RPG. It's not trying to dumb things down, simplify things. It's not trying to make it an action shooter experience or anything like that. It is an RPG and it's unapologetic about it. And I love that. I love the fact that they're not treating the RPG fan base as though they were just basically action gamers who are pretending they want some RPG elements. No, this is aimed at people who want an RPG experience, and honestly, I think there is a massive audience for that. I think a lot of gaming companies have got into this thought process that people are dumb, people want everything to be easy. No, they don't. I know that's a bit of a meme, but it's also wrong. There is a huge fan base of hardcore RPG gamers who want true RPG experiences, and this is one of them. And the fact that this was an independent company who actually basically started off with a big Kickstarter campaign. I remember doing a video back when they were in the Kickstarter phase, and the response they got was amazing. I think even they were stunned by this. They wanted to make this game, and they thought there would be a few people interested, and they were hoping they could get enough of us along to help them. And the response was massive. And it shows you that this core RPG fan base is out there, and that there are companies who want to make those games, and just everything about this I love. The game, the company, the story about how the game came to be, and I am so looking forward to the next game, Kingdom Come whatever it's going to be. I assume it's not going to be Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, but Kingdom Come something, whatever it is. I love the way the game ended. I love the fact that it teased the next game, and I cannot wait. I'm hoping they can, polish a few things, perhaps improve the performance, but honestly, more of the same. Even if they can't get the performance improved, even if they don't manage to polish some of the areas that could have been polished, and they just make more of the same, I'm ready for more of the same, okay? I want more Kingdom Come Deliverance. Loved this game. If you're an RPG fan, if you like trying and occasionally failing and then trying again and succeeding and feeling like, yes, this is a game you should try out.